Y'all, I just got done reading this book, and I think it's a pretty good book, so I thought we would go over it together. Now, the first thing I want to say is it's like 400 pages, and if I went down over all the notes I made about it, this would be well over like a 2-hour video. So I'm going to try to speed run it and just go over the main things. I'm going to use ChatGPT because otherwise this whole thing would just be a giant mess. And occasionally I'm going to read through it and give you like the highlight quotes that I found and try to break them down as they relate to society, because overall this book, while it doesn't overtly get political, it does touch on a lot of things that are very relevant to society, I would say, as a whole today. So first things first, what's the deal with the title? The book makes an analogy that we have the word fragile, something that breaks easily, and we have like it's kind of societally agreed upon opposite of something being like robust or like durable, but there's not really a word for the exact negative, which is like anti-fragile. And he goes through it like this. Let's think about like a package. If you have something that's fragile inside, of course you put a fragile label on it. You're not supposed to shake it around violently because the contents inside will break very easily. Pretend you have like a glass or some china in there. Of course they're going to break. So the thing that we say that's like the opposite now is it's robust or durable. So if you put something inside that's very strong, it's going to be durable and it can withstand a lot of pressure or a lot of pain. Think about like a rock or like an anvil or something that's just going to be generally unbreakable. Well, it's not exactly the opposite because there's not something called anti-fragile in the English language. We have fragile, which is breaking easily. We have something that's like neutral, which is like robust, you know, it can endure stuff, but there's not something that's anti-fragile necessarily that gets stronger every time you fuck with whatever in the package. So for example, if you put like an apple inside of a package, it's not necessarily going to break. It might be a little beat up, but it's going to be durable enough to survive, right? But what happens if you put something inside and you shake it around violently over and over again and the thing actually gets stronger? Well, that's the idea of what anti-fragile is. So that's why the whole book is named Anti-Fragile. Again, I'm going to use ChatGPT to kind of help me out here. I don't necessarily agree with the definition it needs disorder to improve. Disorder makes it sound like, oh, please put some chaos in. But basically, yes, something that gets better from stress volatility or randomness is going to be what we're going to classify as anti-fragile. We can simplify the relationship between fragility, errors, and anti-fragility as follows. When you're fragile, you depend on things following the exact planned course with as little deviation as possible. For deviations are more harmful than helpful. This is why fragile needs to be very predictive in its approach, and conversely, predictive systems cause fragility. When you want deviations and you don't care about the possible dispersion of outcomes that the future can bring, since most will be helpful, you are anti-fragile. Further, the random element in trial and error is not quite random. If it is carried out rationally, using error as a source of information, every trial provides you with information about what does not work. You start zooming in on a solution, so every attempt becomes more valuable, more like an expense than an error. And of course, you make discoveries along the way. Had the Titanic not had that famous accident, as fatal as it was, we would have kept building larger and larger ocean liners, and the next disaster would have been even more tragic, so people who perished were sacrificed for the greater good. They unarguably saved more lives than were lost. The story of the Titanic illustrates the difference between gains for the system and harm to some of its individual parts. Further, for a self-employed person, a small, non-terminal mistake is information, valuable information, one that directs him in his adaptive approach. For someone employed like John, a mistake is something that goes into his permanent record filed with the personnel department. In other words, a point worth repeating every time it applies. This avoidance of small mistakes makes the large ones more severe. So there's about 14 big ideas. We're going to go through them as fast as we can. Volatility is not the enemy. So modern society tries to eliminate it. We try to remove small stressors that create bigger blowups later because we're trying to delay the inevitable. And systems that never get stressed become weak. Think about our bodies. If we don't work out, we become fat and we lose all of our muscles. So suppressing volatility, which is natural, makes systems more fragile, not safer. So when you have like an office job, your salary will always be the same. They're trying to remove as much randomness as possible. I'm going to skip number 3, but basically we want optionality instead of prediction. You don't need to predict the future. You need the options that benefit if the future surprises you. That's like the best thing you can have. It's so much worse if you have the future surprising you in a very negative way. And guess how society is set up at this point? If we have something surprise us, it's generally going to be a negative thing. And this is one of the awesome things of the book. You want upside without the equivalent downside. You lose little if you're wrong, and you gain a fuck ton if you're right. And think about trying to do stuff with educated guesses, right? This is what we try to do with most of our lives. If you're rational, you want to lose as little as possible, having as much upside as you possibly can. Business is a huge example of this. And if you're going to do something that's not like scientific and it's like creative and it's a little bit subjective, you want to keep it that way as much as possible. The opposite isn't true. You don't want to maximize your downside while limiting your upside. That would just be suicidal. An anti-fragile system thrives on uncertainty and not forecasts. Skin in the game, this is one of the better ones. Decision makers must share the downside, right? System breaks when people are rewarded for upside only, so the decision makers must share the downside. Think about like the Iraq War and all these other wars that I've talked about on this channel. The worst problem of modernity lies in the malignant transfer of fragility and anti-fragility from one party to another, with one getting the benefits and the other unwittingly getting the harm, with such transfer facilitated by the growing wedge between the ethical and the legal. This state of affairs has existed before, but is acute today. Modernity hides it especially well. Just like in the example I had mentioned, if people are going to go to war, yet they have no downside, as in they don't send their own offspring into the war, This is like transferring the effects of the war onto other families, but not for themselves. Like, did George Bush send his son into battle? Whenever we have these bureaucratic, giant government people, it's nice that they're making all these policies, but are they putting their own necks on the line by doing this? If they're going to go to war, then isn't it appropriate that we ask that they should send their own offspring into war with ours? And therefore, this would probably disincentivize a lot of things like that. But when we have this asymmetry between decision makers and outcomes like this, it's totally fragile. And I mean, and bankers with bailouts is another example, right? When we look at 2008 and all that horse shit, we just bail them out. So what's the incentive today? Well, the banks can do as much as they want because they know that the government's going to come in and sweep in and save them at the end of the day. So they can be ultra aggressive, and if they lose money, well, they're just going to get bailed out, and they totally bank on that. No pun intended. And convexity is the name of small losses but big gains, limiting your downside and unlimited upside. Via negativa, it's easier to improve by removing harm than adding benefits. Don't add complexity, subtract fragility. So this is like the best example ever. Removing junk food rather than adding some sort of supplements. This is why human beings are a little bit flawed, because we tend to think of things in linear terms. And I remember thinking of this like as a kid. So if you eat like a banana or an apple, does that give you the grounds to eat a cookie or like some sort of sugary thing that's going to do way more damage than like eating an apple and banana would do good for you? No, obviously not. So as human beings, our system is we can only handle so much sugar and all these other like poor choice eating habits before our body really starts to pay the penalty for that. But because we struggle with linearity, we tend to think like, oh yeah, eating one apple gives me the right to eat one cookie. And it's like, no, it doesn't work like that. The negative is far more damaging than the benefits of the good is doing for us. But because we're linear, we have this relationship in our head that you can do that and get away with that. And that's very flawed thinking. You can think about it like this too. If you have $100,000 you're making every year, and you're living, let's just pretend like paycheck to paycheck, right? Or you're finding a way to run out of money, well, the odds are that you, rather than have to make more money, are probably spending too much money, and you can cut down on expenses far easier than making an additional $50,000 or $100,000. If you can save like $10, $15, $25, $35,000, you've just made that money by cutting out your expenses without lifting a finger by making any extra money. Iatrogenics, harm from intervention. Interventions often cause more harm than good. This is very backhandedly political. First, I'll talk about how it is in your body, and then we can talk about how it is with regards to communism. So the way they talk about it in the book is that your body is a very anti-fragile system. It's very strong, and it knows how to fix itself generally. Another way to view it, the iatrogenics is in the patient, not in the treatment. If the patient is close to death, all speculative treatments should be encouraged, no holds barred. Conversely, if the patient is near healthy, then Mother Nature should be the doctor. But with all these doctors and other people who want to get paid by things and want to justify their own existence, they would rather intervene than not do anything. So, rather than waiting for our body to take its time and do things and heal properly, other people will intervene and do surgeries and do all sorts of other shit and say that you should be taking these pills, this pill, that pill, right? Rather than rely on your body, and that'll tend to fuck you up more than if you just let your body do its slow process of healing, which it knows how to do on its own for the most part. Now, for the more fun one, a constant economic stimulus and politics in general. This is what leftists and everyone else tend to struggle with, but a lot of the time, you just have to let things go and take your hands off rather than try to micromanage everything, right? Think about the Great Depression. The story is always that if FDR had just taken his hands off the economy, it wouldn't have been nearly as bad, because the economic shock that was in the 20s, maybe 10 years earlier than the Great Depression, was actually slightly worse, or a little bit worse in every metric or whatever, than the one in the 30s. But because Calvin Coolidge did almost nothing, it healed itself within about 18 months rather than drawing it out all throughout the 30s the way that FDR did, with Smoot-Hawley, Social Security, and plenty of other fun economic interventions. There is an element of deceit associated with interventionism, accelerating in a professionalized society. It's much easier to sell, look what I did for you, than look what I avoided for you. Of course, a bonus system based on performance exacerbates the problem. I've looked in history for heroes who became heroes for what they did not do, but it is hard to observe non-action. I could not easily find any. The doctor who refrains from operating on a back a very expensive surgery, instead of giving it a chance to heal itself, will not be rewarded and judged as favorably as the doctors who make the surgery look indispensable, then brings relief to the patient while exposing him to operating risks, while accruing great financial rewards to himself. The latter will be driving the pink Rolls Royce. The corporate manager who avoids a loss will not often be rewarded. The true hero in the Black Swan world is someone who prevents a calamity, and naturally, because the calamity did not take place, does not get recognition or a bonus for it. An ethical problem arises when someone is put in charge. Greenspan's actions were harmful, but even if he knew that, it would have taken a bit of heroic courage to justify inaction in a democracy where the incentive is always to promise a better outcome than the other guy, regardless of the actual delayed cost. So the point he's making is you can just take your hands off generally and it'll heal itself. It just might take some time. For people who want things instantly and now they're going to try to advocate for interventions as much as possible rather than letting it take its course. And things in life are not fast. People need to get this through their head. It takes time for things to come through. So when you keep trying to intervene, you're trying to take the short-term option, and usually it makes things more fragile in the long term. Society today is going to have a serious problem because we're trying to intervene so much at this point with the government and economic policy that at some point when this bust does come through, it's going to be massive. So he says doing less is often safer than doing more. When it comes to politics, your body, so generally doing less is often safer than doing more. Letting chips fall where they may is usually the better option. Scale increases fragility. So bigger systems fail harder. Small failures are healthy. Large failures are catastrophic, which is largely true. So think about it like this, right? If you go into business for yourself, maybe you have like an employee or two, let's just say you have a team of 3 people and your business fails, not too many people are relying on you, and your 1 or 2 employees can go away relatively unscathed, right? But if you're given 500 employees and you have no track record, you're just getting into this for the first time, and there's going to be way more people relying on your business now just because of the scale of it. And if you go belly up, now you've made the collateral damage of people way bigger. It's just the nature of coming with a big scale. So when it starts talking about centralized governments and local governments, mega corporations, small firms, big banks, and small banks, it says that like if, for example, if a small bank fails, it's not that big of a deal. But if a big bank fails, well, now it's a big fuck up. It can destroy a lot of people's lives. And these are the grounds that, people want, big government bailouts to come out for these banks, even though they were doing things that were highly fragile. The Lindy Effect, this is another good one in the book. The longer something has survived, the longer it's likely to survive. It passes the test of surviving things immediately. So look at the pyramids, for example. They're going to be around for a long time because, well, guess what? They've been around for a long time. This applies to books, ideas, and traditions and technology. And really the important one is ideas here. So when we look at societal conservatism or like marriage or whatever, these things have been around for a very long time and they've survived for a reason. So when people try to come in and change the norm and try to say that we should be having as much sex as possible, we shouldn't be committing to people, we should be getting abortions, these things are all fine, we should be taking money from men and give it to women in general through the power of the government. Well, these things have not been around for a while, and there's a reason, because every time they get tried, they die. And guess what we're doing in society today? So nonlinear harm is damage is proportional. It looks at the Bible, Shakespeare, and bread and olive oil, because bread has been around for who knows how long at this point. But because it's survived for so long, the longer it survives, the longer it's going to survive generally. Nonlinear harm, damage is not proportional. Doubling stress can cause 10 times damage. This is where convexity and such comes in. Debt pollution, sleep deprivation, and stress on intuitions, right? So sleep deprivation is a good one. Let's pretend, if this is another thing that's nonlinear. If you get 8 hours of sleep, you are generally going to say 100% charged. We'll pretend like that arbitrary term is going to work. If you get 6 hours of sleep, well, you're not going to be 75% charged. You might be more like 60%. And if you get 2 hours of sleep, you're not going to be 25% charged because you got 2 hours out of 8 hours. You're going to be more like 10%, and 3 hours is going to be like 25%. So you get really fucked up the less sleep you get. And that's what that is. It's not linear in that thing. And we tend to be, because we're human beings, we tend to think things are extremely linear, and a lot of the time they are not. Look at compound interest. The first 20 years, it feels like it's pretty linear. It's going up a little, but then it becomes totally and completely exponential by the 30th year, or the 25th year, or the 35th year, around there. And as human beings, that's really, really hard to conceptualize. As humans, we're just not that good with nonlinear things. Naïve interventionism, this is a good one. People overestimate what they know, of course. Experts often mistake randomness for skill. Totally true. Just look at the stock market. Also, people overestimate what they know. If you ask 100 people what percentage of them are good drivers, the overwhelming majority are going to say they're good drivers, right? But that's statistically not possible. Therefore, we know that people have their, biases thinking about how good they are, right? And this applies to everything. You can look at poker, you can look at the government, you can look at whatever. This is almost always going to be the case. And of course, people are going to beat their chests and beat their drum and say, yep, that's right, that's why I'm so good. You should have me keep this job, because if they didn't, well, then they'd lose their job or lose other things, right? So by batting for yourself, you are doing yourself a favor to at least not lose the job, even if it's damaging in the long term. Economists predicting crises, totally. Analysts backfitting explanations. Oh, this is the worst, right? When we look at history, and this is really, really dangerous, people will say like, oh, World War II was inevitable. This was always going to happen. The Soviet Union collapsing, obvious. This was super obvious. How do people not know this? Well, if you're like in 1975, do you really think the Soviet Union's going to collapse and it's inevitable? No. This is people who are living in the post-90s that see it now and can say, oh, how could you not see this coming, right? The important difference between theory and practice lies precisely in the detection of the sequence of events and retaining the sequence in memory. If life is lived forward but remembered backwards, as Kierkegaard observed, then books exacerbate this effect. Our own memories, learning, and instincts have sequences in them. Someone standing today looking at events without having lived them would be inclined to develop illusions of causality, mostly from being mixed up by the sequence of events. In real life, in spite of all the biases, we do not have the same number of asynchronies that appear to the student of history. Nasty history full of lies, full of biases. A lot of the time, you can't predict the future because the future is so fucking random. And I'm not saying don't listen to people that do have an explanation for, like, you know, looking at things and backdating it, but you have to listen to their argument. If their argument is very, very weak and they seem to have no understanding and they just talk in generalities of things in the past, they probably don't know what the hell they're talking about, and they're one of these people that, like, are backfitting things because it's so obvious in, 40 years after the fact. Yeah, it's obvious that it was going to happen, maybe, but at the time, how could you have possibly known? Oh, well, this is super easy. If we just put ourselves in their shoes, we wouldn't know. It's like, no, you wouldn't have. In the complex world, the notion of cause itself is suspect. It is either nearly impossible to detect or not really defined. Another reason to ignore newspapers with their constant supply for causes of things. Look at today. Whatever's going to happen in a few years is going to seem obvious in 40 years to people who are looking back at it, but in the current timeline, it's very hard to predict the future because it's just so random. Policy based on models detached from a reality. And this is the case too. We think we have all the criteria and the data, and therefore we can make a model about it, but sometimes there's stuff that's off the books that you can't necessarily quantify, and by missing it, you miss a huge chunk of it. Trial and error beats theory. This is a great one, and this is part of the reason why I like this book a lot. Evolution works without understanding. Like, if you try to teach a bird how to fly and you make it go to class before it learns how to fly, that would be stupid because it can fly on its own without understanding it necessarily. If you try to teach someone how to take a hockey shot, in theory before they do it, well, yeah, the theory is useful, but at the end of the day, you can't just sit there and calculate on the ice, okay, if I just do this and then I just hit it hard, that'll work. You just have to get the puck and just slam the fuck out of it and try to get it in the goal. And by doing that hundreds and hundreds of times, you'll get better and better, and that's like what it means, trial and error, beating theory. Like, and this is what I love about this book. It goes on a very long tangent, and I'll probably read some pieces of this, but it goes on a very long tangent about how academia is full of shit and how we like to put everything in theory, but at the end of the day, it's all fucking useless or very, very impractical because of this concept. You can't tell someone how to take that hockey shot. They just have to do it for themselves, and you can understand and dance around and try to jerk off to the thought of, like, oh yeah, I can totally understand this, but at the end of the day, if you're not doing it, well, then you're not actually doing it. Screen showed that we've been building and using jet engines in a completely trial and error experiential manner without anyone truly understanding the theory. Builders needed the original engineers who knew how to twist things and make the engine work. Theory came later in a lame way to satisfy the intellectual bean counter. Fragility of knowledge and forecasting, we know less than what we think. Of course, black swans dominate outcomes. Black swans being these things that don't exist until you see them. And then forecasts create false confidence. This is 100% true. I wouldn't listen to anyone about a lot of things, especially if they're in academia, because forecasts make it sound like if you put things into this tiny box, then it's completely and totally immune to any other X factor. The world is driven by rare extreme events, not averages, of course. So anti-fragile systems gain from disorder, avoid prediction, limit downside, embrace optionality, and improve through stress rather than stability. People who have office jobs are going to be more prone to randomness than people who have random jobs. So one of the last things is the time is the ultimate stress test. The longer something survives, the longer it will survive. Fragile systems look strong until they fail. This is a huge fucking point, and look at the government today. It looks strong, it looks like it's stable, but we all fucking know if you look into it, it's just gonna go bust at some point. Anti-fragile systems quietly improve with each shock. Yep, a trading strategy that works for 2 years versus 20 years, totally big and different ballgame. A political system that survives generations. A technology that outlives hype cycles. So this could be almost anything. It could be like a ball or a sport. It could be like a cultural phenomenon like that. It could be a wheel. It could be an automobile. It could be a cart. It could be something that's been around for a very long time. If something needs constant rescue, time is exposing it. The government to lead repeatedly stresses. Avoid ruin first. Okay, one of the other things that I really like in this is anything that can permanently destroy you is unacceptable. Absolutely. If we look at something in like the binary sense of like 1 we survive, 0 we are destroyed, and that's game over, then permanent destruction is unacceptable, and I agree. Even small probabilities of ruin compound over time because, of course, time is the ultimate tester. This is why debt is dangerous and centralized systems are fragile. So the asymmetry of time, benefits can compound positively and harm compounds faster and more destructively. A system that loses 50% needs 100% to recover. Of course, if you take if you put $100 in to the stock market and then you lose $50 of it, well, now you need to gain 100% to get back to where you were. The system that gets 50% will just keep going. So when we look at investing, I guess this is looking more like the Book of Money by Tony Robbins. And this is why I kind of hate the idea of the stock market, is because if you put in $100, like I said, and then you lose your first few years because some investor told you to do that, well, then you are fucked and it's going to take a long time to get out of that hole. Whereas if you gain in the first few years through randomness of the same investor, well, then you're going to be way further better off than the first guy. Does the guy really know what he's doing when he tells you that? You don't really know. Alright, so what would I give this book out of 10? I would say its novelty with ideas is like an 8, 8.5. Its digestibility is probably like a 6 or a 7, maybe not a 7. 7 kind of starts to feel like it's a little too easy. I would recommend focusing while you read this book, but it's not going to be super dry and it's engaging, but sometimes you kind of just, feel the need to step away because it does have like a lot of ideas and attacks you with a lot of them. Now granted, I read The Black Swan before. I didn't do a book review on it because I didn't have this channel at the time, but this book has a lot in common with The Black Swan. Not a ton, but enough to be like, okay, I've seen these ideas before. And to be fair, it's fine to have them reinforced, right? But it does have a lot of overlap. So when I read Skin in the Game, I don't know when I'm going to read that. But that's his third book. I'm assuming that there's going to be a lot of overlap specifically in that book with this, and as well as the ideas in The Black Swan. Don't get me wrong, the ideas are good. I'm not criticizing that. I'm just saying that I'm expecting to be a little repetitive. So overall, very good ideas, mostly pretty engaging, quite novel, goes through lots of stuff, not overtly political and pretty novel. So I would give the book like an 8, maybe a 7.5 out of 10, and I recommend you at least look into it. And again, not everything in the book is perfect, but a lot of things have some pretty strong merit. Hopefully you found something you could take away from this, and maybe even considering the book yourself. There's plenty of good stuff in it. I only touched the very most highlights of it, and you'll probably find some other stuff in there that you didn't think about before. A lot of the analogies he uses are pretty strong, and again, I highly recommend reading it. We are more easily swayed by a crying baby than by thousands of people dying elsewhere that do not make it to our living room through the TV set. The one case is a tragedy, the other is a statistic. Our emotional energy is blind to probability. The media makes things worse, as they play on our infatuation with anecdotes, our thirst for the sensational, and they cause a great deal of unfairness that way. At the present time, one person dying of diabetes every 7 seconds, but the news can only talk about hurricane victims with houses flying in the air. Also, think about China and how much slave labor we instill over there and get products over here. Sure, we have our nice shirt and we can buy it for a little bit cheaper than if it was made in America, but we don't see the other person suffering, so we just say, oh, it's a shirt and it says made in China. This is totally fine. And things were totally blind to the amount of people that are suffering in China or wherever else that make it, rather than us paying a real living wage here in the United States. That's the trade-off. I wonder how people can accept that the stressors of exercise are good for you, but do not transfer to the point that food deprivation can have the same effect. But scientists are in the process of discovering the effects of episodic deprivation of some or all foods. Somehow, evidence shows we get sharper and fitter in response to the stress of constraint. Just like we were born and raised, through evolution, there was not a constant food supply all throughout human history. Even within medicine, some get it here and miss it there. The same doctor might recommend exercise so you get tougher, and within a few minutes later, write a prescription for antibiotics in response to a trivial infection so you don't get sick.